We have heard God's word for us, read and spoken. We tried to place ourselves on that shoreline in the midst of the crowd when Jesus was coming ashore. Because surely we all have something we would like to tell Jesus. Maybe there was even a few of us that really feel the need today to reach out and to touch the hem of his robe, his clothing. We can do that. We, the church, can be that place where no one is forgotten, where all can find a way to be in relationship and to even reach out and to feel as though you're touching the presence of Christ. Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for your holy word and for gathering us here this morning. Bring us out of the crowd and help us to focus and be just with you. Our lives are busy, are complicated. There are challenges and suffering. We take this moment, O Lord, to reflect upon your word and what it means for us as people, as individuals, and as the church. May we gain strength and courage and faith and not be afraid to use this holy word for your good purposes through our lives. Amen. Amen. Well, some of you know that in a few weeks, and I say that with some fear and trembling, that my daughter, Shira, my youngest daughter, will be moving to New York City. New York City to go to college. Why in the world she wants to go to New York City, I have no idea. But she does, that's right. Ever since she was little, probably around the age of 8, she had mastered many of the subway routes of New York City. She would go with Faye, my wife, and love and eat up New York City, both figuratively and literally. They'd have a great time. I'd stay here. And if I had my way, I would go north while they were going south. I don't know what it is about me. It's about me. It's the New York City thing. I've only been to New York City maybe 2 or 3 times in my life. And I've always gone with a direct purpose to get there and to get out as fast as I can. Whether it was for a meeting or to buy something very special that I needed from New York City, but I did not ever want to spend much time there. And part of it for me, I think it is the crowds. Where I go to New York City is, if I ever go, is probably downtown Manhattan. So the sidewalks are always full. It's during the daytime. And I just feel like, wow, there's a lot of people and these buildings are so big and I'm so tiny. I really feel out of my element, out of my place. But that's where my youngest daughter wants to be. She wants to be in New York City, so maybe, just maybe, I'll learn a little bit more about New York City and come to appreciate some of the great things that are there. Because I know that millions and millions upon millions of people love New York City. And as they say, and this is my fear as a father, once you go to New York City, you never come back out. Yeah. So keep us in prayer. It is a story about being a small fish in a big pond. It is a story about being in the crowd. It is a story about being a tiny little speck in the big picture of the world, of the universe. Our gospel lesson tells us how Jesus was coming from one place to another. He had crossed over into non-Jewish territory to minister to those who were in need, and then got back in the boat with his disciples and came back into the land that he was born in to continue his ministry. And in the land that he was born in and raised in and was ministering most in, people got to know him. And so as we hear this story from the Gospel of Mark, we can imagine that it's towards the end of his earthly ministry. It's before he goes to Jerusalem that last time. But it's a time when he was very, very famous. He was a rock star. People knew him. And if they didn't know him, they heard about him. And if they hadn't heard about him, somebody nearby was poking them and saying, "Do you know about this Rabbi Jesus? He's coming back over here to be with us. You need to come and listen to him. You need to come and bring the sick and bring the lonely and to be in his presence because it's amazing." And so Jesus is coming across the ocean. And there can be no when we hear this story that the ministry and mission of Jesus has now gotten be almost full speed. The big picture is what the gospel gives us. The whole gospel gives us the big picture of what Jesus was doing in his life, what happened with his death, and of course his resurrection. But this morning the gospel tells us that the big picture is a large crowd that's gathered around Jesus as he arrives on the shore. Think about that. Think about large crowds upon the shore. Today, when I think about that image, I think about migrants from Africa, moving north from different parts of the sub-Sahara, from all over the continent, trying to get to the shores of Libya. I think about that voyage, that dangerous sailing trip that they will take to try to get to the shores of Europe. I think about Jesus being in the midst of those who are struggling and suffering, trying to find a better life. And so I think about this story as a story that is still very real in our world today. And there's the crowd gathered as Jesus comes to them. And Jesus is with sight. And there's a religious leader. There's somebody in the crowd that has a little bit more status than others. His name is Jairus. He's a synagogue leader, religious leader. And somehow he gets to the front of the crowd. Maybe he had some other religious leaders there holding back the crowd as Jairus got to be right there as the boat just lands on the sand. Before Jesus could even stand up in the boat, I imagine Jairus is walking out into the shallow part of the beach, tears in his eyes, knowing that his daughter is near death. He looks into the eyes of Jesus and he calls upon Jesus, not even with a word, with just his heart. He's pouring out to Jesus prayers that he would come and lay hands on his daughter to bring healing so that she may live. So Jairus gets to Jesus, utters a few words, and just falls on his knees. He's a religious leader. He knows what it means to fall on your knees, to bow before the altar of God. And he does just that with Jesus. He falls on his knees to Jesus and he begs and he pleads with Jesus, please come with me, come home, please. My daughter is so sick. I don't think she's only just 12 years old. Will you come? Jesus, being Jesus, of course, is moved. And he says, yes, I'll go with you. So Jesus gets out of the boat, and his disciples are gathering up the stuff that's in the boat, and they're trying to find their way. But the crowd is just so great. It's around. People are pushing and shoving. You know how we get when we get into a crowd and we want something? We get awful rude. We get anxious. We want to get to it first. So Jesus packs up, gets ready to go with Jairus, trying to tend to the crowd that continues to grow around him, and they're pushing and shoving, and there within that pushing and shoving appears a woman. Everybody knows who she is. What is she doing here? Be careful, don't touch her. She's been sick for as long as I can remember. Hemorrhaging, bleeding. And friends, you know that in the time of Jesus, that if anyone was bleeding like that, he was so unclean. You don't get near that person at all. And so I imagine what was appearing to be a crowd around Jesus. As soon as she appeared, whoa, get away! There became this huge opening. And there was this woman who somehow, before that opening appeared, reached out through the crowd, probably shoving here and grabbed just the hem of Jesus' robe. And she in her heart and her body could feel the healing power of God through Christ coming into her body and transforming her. Transforming her to where she should be and wanted to be and longed to be. After visiting 12 doctors or so, taking all of her money, she had some at one time, I guess. They tried everything, but nothing worked. And finally, she met the doctor of all doctors, the healer of all healers. And she reached out and she felt the bleeding stop. Amen. Amen. She's shaking. She's trembling. Tears are coming down her face. She just can't believe that God has done this for her. After so many years of isolation and denial, after being such a tiny little speck in the universe that she lived in, she now finds herself glowing and energized and feeling whole once again. Jesus, on the other hand, feels something too. He feels the power drain out of him, not to exhaustion, but just feels like he gifted someone, I believe, with healing. Who touched me, he says. Who touched me? Disciples are standing around. What's this guy asking? Who touched me? You can see that the crowd was huge around him. Who touched me? Get these people away, Jesus. We got to go get something to eat. I'm starving. Jesus said, who touched me? And there at the same time, this woman falls down on her knees. She's like Jairus. She comes to worship. And she falls down on her knees and she says, it was me, I touched you. And Jesus believes that he has found someone, a true disciple, who believes in him, who believes in the healing power of God, and says to her, blessed are you, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. As a new person, she goes. And surely she goes telling the story of how she was healed. Jesus moves on to Jairus' house finally, and everybody's there. They already hired the mourners to come in and to cry and to grieve and to just wail at the death of this very young child. Jesus is puzzled. He didn't come to conduct a funeral. He came to heal. So what are you doing? Why are you carrying on like this? She's not dead. She's sleeping. They laugh. They're having a little bit of a chuckle, even in the midst of grief on Jesus' account. He says, get out of here. Probably not that way. Probably did something else. But move on. Leave this room. Come with me, trusted disciples. Come with me, Jairus. Let's be with your daughter. And there in his native tongue, he speaks to this child and tells her to rise up. And she does. He extends his hand just as the woman who was healed extended her hand. She reached out for Jesus. Jesus reaches out for this 12-year-old and raises her up. She gets up and she walks. People look around. The same ones that were mourning and grieving, and probably some of those that were trying to sneak a peek at what was going on, that were laughing at Jesus, they see that she's walking. They're astonished. They can't believe it. How could it be? Our gospel lessons are about the healing power of God and Jesus. That's very clear to us. But there are also stories about ordinary people. People like you and I. People that don't stand out in the crowd. They're about us, a people who are moved within crowds into different places. We come out of the crowds, yes, we stand out, not because of who we are, but what we believe in. Our faith makes us stand out. Our faith makes us maybe appear a little bit different. Our faith makes us do things differently than maybe the direction or the way the crowd is moving. These are two characteristics that, unlike Jesus and Jairus, these are two characters, I would say, not characteristics, these are two characters. The 12-year-old and this woman who's been bleeding for 12 years, they're characters, they're not like Jesus and Jairus. They have no religious authority. They're the ordinary, they're the unsuspecting in the crowd with serious challenges and problems. They live in the big picture of life. They are insignificant in this huge religious world. That in some ways, they both are unclean. They are both to be set aside. They're both to be forgotten. They're both to be deemed unworthy of God's grace and healing. Something happened. You remember back in the day of Jesus, if you were that sick, there was something had happened. You had did something wrong. Either it was your sin or the sin of your parents. Somehow, sin, brokenness, had caused you to be sick. especially if you're running out of time because death is near, or no physician could heal you, that must have been a very, very serious sin. Jesus appears. Jesus goes in the direction of those who are most in pain and hurting in the story. He goes, he answers the call of one who stood by that 12-year-old, even in her most difficult times. The father could not let go. He stood with her and asked Jesus to come. And there's that woman that all these people tried to help as professionals, and all these other people kind of stepped away from her. But Jesus steps right into that space in the crowd and extends his hand. He extends the healing presence of God. And so this morning, if you would, I'd like you just to focus your attention, your heart, on the Jesus that appears in this crowd, the Jesus, the rabbi, who draws swarms of people around him. So many people, but never loses the sight of one individual. The Jesus who has you in his sight. I want you to focus on the thought that there's this wonderful, loving Jesus who's in the presence of the Holy Spirit that is always caring for us, looking for us, looking out for us in some way. We may not always feel it. But the truth is that out of these stories we learn that Jesus is able to pick out the most needy in the crowd, not losing sight of every individual there. I pray that you'll focus your attention this morning on Jesus the Rabbi who draws the swarms but does not lose sight of the ordinary or the forgotten, so that you, when you feel ordinary or extraordinary or forgotten, that you remember that Jesus has not lost sight of you. Because sometimes we can feel that way. We really can. We can feel like we're on the shore and Jesus just went by. Didn't even wave. Forgot us. Life can be that way. But the stories of the gospel say, no, it's not that way, that Jesus does not forget the forgotten and cares for those who are deemed not worthy of care. Frank Mason North, who wrote the hymn that we just sang, "We're across the crowded ways of life," understood these stories. Frank Mason North was born in the later part of the 19th century. He grew up, actually, in New York, but moved to Connecticut to attend Wesleyan College at the time. He was a devout Methodist. He wrote in his own essays that he was born a Methodist, always was going to be a Methodist. And there are many, many reasons that he was a Methodist. It wasn't just because one of his parents was born a Methodist and he was brought to Sunday school and to Epworth League and so on and so forth. He went to Wesleyan and he studied there and he became an ordained preacher. He preached in Connecticut and had churches in New York as well. But obviously had the gift for writing hymns. And in 1926, he wrote this essay, "Why Am I a Methodist?" It's very Wesleyan. John Wesley wrote a lot of sermons and essays about why he is who he is. And so the title itself sounds very Wesleyan. And he wrote this 8-page, 9-page essay about himself, and he goes through all the history of the Methodist movement, using it as a way to tell the reader why he's a Methodist. And then he gets to the end of it, which says something very much about this hymn that we just sang, about who he is and why he's a Methodist, and the connection between the social gospel, or the gospel that we just heard today, in his heart and his ability to write music. In his essay, he wrote, and I quote, "Methodism has been sensitive to the disasters, the distress, the injustices, and the inequalities of the social industrial order." What he's saying is that Methodism was always present in the crowd, looking at the world and all its different needs. And that for that reason, he was not only committed to Methodism, that he wanted to use his gifts to extend that social message. He also said, and I quote, "In spirit and in action, it has been, the Methodist Church, from its beginning, a friend of the poor." For me, that is a direct connection between our tradition as Methodists, the gospel of Jesus Christ, and Jesus, to be a friend of the poor. The crowds that we wander in are always filled with people in poverty, whether it's material poverty, spiritual poverty, physical poverty. We are all poor in some reason, in some way. And so when we think about this story and think about what North has to say to us about why he's a Methodist, I pray that you'll make that same connection. The reason that you're a Methodist is because you want to be able to be part of that crowd that makes that connection with Jesus, but also want to be part of the Jesus movement that makes a connection with the crowd and ministers to it. It was North who walked alongside other Methodists in the early 1900s that wrote a response to the conditions of industrial strife and poverty in the urban areas. He helped write the Methodist Social Creed, which has given to us a lot of the backbone of what makes us who we are today, those people of both personal piety and social holiness. North was committed to being a Methodist because the way Methodists lived out the gospel of Jesus Christ among the ordinary, the forgotten, and suffering. And to tell you the truth, that's why I'm a Methodist too. That's what I understood God's call to be to me as a Methodist. To go out into the world, to join my hands and hearts with people like you, to make a difference in the crowds. So I want you to remember this verse. It's verse 3 from North's hymn. From tender childhood's helplessness, you think of the 12-year-old in the gospel story who's on death's edge. From tender childhood's helplessness, from the woman's grief, the woman who's been grieving over her loss of life, and from man's hardened toil, from famished souls, from sorrow, stress, your heart has never known recoil. Speaking to Jesus, that no matter what the condition was in the crowd, Jesus' heart never recoiled. Being a small fish in a big pond can make anyone feel helpless. You can feel burdened, even famished. That's why it's so important for us today, the church, to be looking carefully into the crowd. Looking carefully, and I would say prayerfully, into the crowd. What do we see? What do we sense? Where is there a need? Where can we be ministered to as well as be the ministers to the crowd? It's important that we take time and pay attention to what is happening around us, all around us. And if we dare to look into the crowd and make known the love of Jesus in spirit and action, as North says about the United Methodist Church, I believe and I have experienced how astonishing things will happen, just as the crowd saw the healed child of 12 walk. If we dare to go into that crowd in spirit and action of the gospel, willing to extend our hands to reach Jesus' hands, as well as to be the hand that's extended on behalf of Jesus. Well, New York City's not for me. Too much. Too much. Big crowds. Maybe over time I'll see it differently. I'll see the crowds differently. Maybe I'll listen to my own preaching and see that in these crowds are people of God. And I can too find, maybe not a connection, but can be prayerfully open to what they may have for me. Maybe someday I'll find the beauty and the excitement of the big city. I don't know. But for now, you know what? I'm really happy right here. I'm really happy right here. Right here at East Hartford, getting to know my neighbors and sharing with you this astonishing ministry of Jesus Christ. And the joy of being a Methodist. The joy of being a Methodist. A Methodist that is called, just like you and I and all of us, to live both these lives of personal piety, worship, and prayer, and study, but also the life of going out in social holiness to make the connections on behalf of Jesus Christ so others may come to know His love as well. We're not called to stand out in the crowd, to say, look at me. We're called to stand in the crowd and to reach out to find Jesus, to see Jesus' healing for ourselves, but at the same time to reach out to others, to bring others, to introduce them to Jesus and his healing powers through the acts of mercy and charity and justice. It's not our job to worry about how we're going to stand out in the crowd, but to stand in it and serving in the name of the one who knows us all by name. Don't forget that Jesus knows us all by name. Crowd or no crowd, we are all God's beloved. Amen.
Amen.
Let us